In this video, we'll be looking at the causes, events, and significance of the First World War, but from a German perspective. Again, this is part of the AQA course, but if you're doing Edexcel, this is also extremely relevant background knowledge and will help you understand later events. So to understand why Germany went to war in 1914, we need to look at foreign policy, which means relationships with other countries. After the unification of Germany in 1871, this was a new and powerful nation that was slapped right in the middle of Europe, which was obviously quite threatening for its neighbours. Germany's first Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, believed that another major war could destroy the new German Empire. As a result, he avoided expansion and focused on maintaining peace in Europe. His aim was to keep a balance of power between the European nations by forming alliances and diplomacy. But when Kaiser Wilhelm II came to power in 1888, German foreign policy changed dramatically. He rejected Bismarck's peaceful and cautious approach and instead wanted Germany to become a global power with control of other countries. At the time, Germany didn't really have a global empire like that of the French or the British, but they wanted to be on the same level. From the late 1890s, Germany followed a foreign policy called Weltpolitik, or world politics. The aim was to build a German empire overseas and increase Germany's international influence, which, as you can imagine, did not go down so well with the British or the French, who resented German expansionism. German politics was strongly influenced by Prussian militarism. Many of the Kaiser's closest advisors were also senior army officers. They encouraged Wilhelm to expand Germany's military, especially the navy. The government passed a series of naval laws which dramatically increased spending on battleships. This brought Germany into direct competition with the world's strongest navy, the British Royal Navy, who ruled the oceans. Although the Kaiser's grandmother was Queen Victoria, he had a personal hatred of Britain and its culture and wanted Germany to rival them. In 1906, Britain launched the HMS Dreadnought, a massive and powerful new warship that made all existing ships outdated. This triggered an intense Anglo-German naval arms race, and military spending increased rapidly as the government raised taxes and went into heavy debt to pay for rearmament. Many members of the Reichstag criticised the spending, arguing that the money should be used to improve living conditions, but the Kaiser largely ignored them to build his new boats. By 1914, Germany had damaged relations with most of the European powers, undoing all the work Bismarck had done. Britain, France and Russia had formed an alliance called the Triple Entente in case war ever broke out with Germany. But the Kaiser did have a friend in Austria-Hungary, and things were put to the test when their Archduke and a personal friend to the Kaiser, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. During the July crisis, Germany offered its full support to Austria-Hungary with the infamous blank check. This promised to provide Austria-Hungary with whatever they needed against Serbia. This crisis soon triggered a chain of reaction of alliances, and by August 1914, Europe was at war. German leaders claimed that Germany was fighting a defensive war and was a victim of unprovoked aggression. Young patriotic Germans thought that the war would be over in months and enlisted in large numbers. They had no idea about the scale of destruction to come. I'm not going to go into too much depth over the actual military events of the war because it's not on the course, but I'll give you a quick overview because it's very useful to know. So Germany faced a difficult situation, a war on two fronts, Russia in the east and Britain and France to the west. Their blueprint for victory was something called the Schlieffen Plan, which aimed to take out the French quickly by invading through neutral Belgium, then turn east to take out the Russians. This plan failed, and by late 1914, fighting on the Western Front had become a stalemate, with both sides digging in trenches to hold their ground. World War I was nothing like the world had ever seen before, with trench warfare and new weapons like machine guns, poison gas and tanks made this war brutal and deadly. Battles such as Verdun or the Somme saw hundreds of thousands of casualties just to gain a few square miles of lost territory. Many millions of young people from both sides would eventually lose their lives from this war. Knowing America was likely to enter the war, in 1917 Germany also sent the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico, encouraging them to attack the USA in return for American territory. When the telegram was intercepted, it led to the USA declaring war on Germany. It would take over a year though for America to actually mobilize a large army in Europe, and in that time there were some hopes for Germany. Germany's pet project of sending Vladimir Lenin to Russia paid off, and the Communist Revolution resulted in Russia pulling out of the war. In March 1918, Germany imposed a brutal treaty on Russia called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which in many ways was much worse than the Treaty of Versailles imposed on Germany after the war. With the end of the Eastern Front, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers moved to the Western Front to launch the Spring Offensive in a final attempt to win the war. It was initially successful, but they suffered heavy casualties and they failed to capture Paris. By the summer of 1918, large numbers of American troops were arriving in Europe. When the already exhausted German army saw waves and waves of fresh American troops arriving on the front, this was completely demoralizing for them, and they began to push the Germans back. Morale had collapsed and the army was facing imminent defeats. But back home in Germany, conditions were also terrible. Since the beginning of the war, the British imposed a naval blockade of Germany and stopped all food imports coming into the country. Germany started rationing bread in 1915, and in the turnip winter of 1916 to 1917, food shortages became so severe that turnips, normally animal feeds, became the food for civilians. It is estimated that over 400,000 civilians died from starvation in Germany. Society also began to be more divided, as factory owners were producing things needed for the war effort, making a fortune, whilst workers were seeing wage cuts and rising prices. With the decline in living standards, socialism was even more heightened during the war, as it felt the rich were feeding off the poor, and there was a fear that Germany might go the way of Russia in revolution. There was massive strikes throughout the war. One in January 1918 resulted in 400,000 workers in Berlin striking. People were fed up with the drop in living standards, but at the same time, to keep morale high, propaganda throughout the war was telling the German people that the war was successful and that they were very close to victory. It wasn't until the last few weeks of the war that people began to think something was going wrong. This set the scene for the German Revolution. On October 28th, sailors in Kiel began to launch an uprising, as they were ordered to sail out for a last, near-suicidal battle against the British Royal Navy. Knowing that the war was lost, the sailors launched the Kiel Mutiny, and the news of the uprising began to spread. Workers and soldiers took over towns and cities, and within 6 days controlled the major cities in Germany. The Kaiser had lost control of his army, and the generals told him that the war was lost and refused to support him. On the 9th of November, the Kaiser abdicated and fled Germany. Wilhelm lived the rest of his days out in the Netherlands, hoping that one day the monarchy would be restored. Friedrich Ebert, leader of the Social Democrats, took over the Kaiser's place as the leader of Germany and promised to hold elections. The army generals were quite tactical here because they knew that the politicians would have to face the blame for losing the war and peace negotiations with Britain, France and America, which was always going to be unpopular. On the 11th of November, Germany signed the armistice, ending the First World War. The public were shocked. Propaganda made them think that the war was going well, and foreign troops never actually entered Germany's soil. Down the line, the stab in the back myth was born, which blamed Germany's loss in the war on the November criminals, the politicians, socialists and revolutionaries that betrayed Germany in the war. This myth would have serious consequences in the years to come. On that note, that's where I'll end the video. The next one will focus on the birth of the Weimar Republic and democracy in Germany after the war. See you then.